You ever spend weeks running research, synthesizing insights, building a clean, thoughtful case, only to hear this in a meeting? Yeah, but I talked to one customer who hated it. And suddenly, everything shifts. Months of patterns get outweighed by one conversation. That's not strategy, that's the anecdotal fallacy. It's our tendency to let a single vivid story override a mountain of actual evidence. And this week, we're breaking down why stories hit harder than stats, how it messes with our teams, and what we can do to keep one person's experience from becoming the whole team's strategy. What's up, UX fam? Welcome to another edition of the Cognition Catalog, where every week or so, we'll dig into a new cognitive bias and explore how that bias can impact how our team works together and what we can do to ensure we don't get caught up in the pitfalls. Because working with people is hard, and the more insights we have into the human condition make it just a little bit easier. To learn more about the anecdotal fallacy, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com. Sign up for the newsletter to get a new bias in your inbox every week, and make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never have to fall for any of these cognitive biases again. And if you think you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That would help me out so much more than you know. Shout out to this week's sponsor, Case Owl. Stop second-guessing your case studies and your presentations. Case Owl uses AI to score your clarity, narrative strength, and alignment with best practices. Then it gives you specific fixes, not vague advice. Try it for free at caseowl.com or use my code BeyondUX for 50% off. That's caseowl with 2 O's.com. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, and Zoe for all their support. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then for the love of God, tell your mom and them. So we've all been there. You're sitting in a meeting. Maybe it's a design review. Maybe it's a retro. Maybe it's a roadmap discussion. The team has done the work. They do the research. There's data. There's dashboards full of signals pointing in a clear direction. And then somebody shares a story. My neighbor tried to sign up and couldn't figure out the flow. I saw a post on Reddit where someone said the onboarding was confusing. A friend of mine works in fintech, and they said nobody uses that pattern anymore. And suddenly, the energy in the room kind of shifts. The data doesn't disappear, but it fades into the background. Story takes over, usually because it's very specific or because it's relatable. It feels real in a way that a chart or data never really will. That's the thing about anecdotes. They're not necessarily wrong. Maybe the neighbor did struggle. Maybe that one Reddit post had a point. But a single story isn't evidence. It's a data point of one. And when we treat it like it represents the whole picture, we're falling for the anecdotal fallacy. I've seen this play out more times than I can count. A stakeholder shares one piece of customer feedback from a sales call, and suddenly the team is redesigning a feature that 95% of users have no issues with. Or an engineer pushes back on a technology choice because they had a bad experience with it 3 jobs ago, in a completely different context on a completely different team. The story is compelling, so it wins, even when the data says otherwise. The hardest part is that it doesn't feel like a bias when it's happening. It feels like good judgment. It feels like common sense. It feels like you're being responsive and you're listening to real people. And that's exactly why it's so effective at throwing us off course. It never feels like a bias in the moment. Now, none of this means that we should ignore stories like these. Stories matter. They give us context that numbers never will. But there's a big difference between using a story to ask better questions and using a story to make the decision. One leads to better research. The other leads to chasing anecdotes. So what is the anecdotal bias? Well, we tend to let a single vivid story or personal experience carry more weight than a large body of statistical evidence. The anecdotal fallacy happens when we use one memorable example as proof of a general claim, while ignoring mountains of data that say otherwise. The anecdotal fallacy doesn't stem from one isolated discovery in psychology. Instead, it sort of sits at the intersection of research on heuristics, narrative cognition, and our deep preference for clean explanations. In the 1970s, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman demonstrated that humans rely on cognitive shortcuts when judging probability and frequency. Now, one of these shortcuts is called the availability heuristic, and we've covered it here in the show. It explains why easily recalled examples feel more common than they actually are. But there's another important piece. We prefer explanations that feel complete. A single story provides a clear cause and effect arc. It gives us a beginning, it gives us a middle, and it gives us an end. It feels coherent. Data, on the other hand, it reveals distributions and ranges and variation. It shows us that outcomes exist on a spectrum rather than in absolutes. And humans hate spectrums. Stories, on the other hand, collapse complexity into one concrete example. But statistics surface the complexity that was already there. Communications research consistently shows that personal narratives often outperform aggregate data in persuasion. Not because people reject evidence, but because stories are easier to process and they're easier to remember. Now, the danger isn't that the stories are emotional, it's that they hide scale. A story shows that something happened. Data shows us how often it happens. The fallacy begins when we confuse the two. It's important to remember that the power of anecdotes isn't accidental. Humans evolved as storytellers. Before we had dashboards and analytics tools, we had stories around the campfire. And stories are easier to remember, they're easier to share, and they're easier to emotionally connect with. Data requires interpretation. Stories require imagination. And that makes them sticky and dangerous when they stand in for evidence. On product teams, the anecdotal fallacy shows up constantly and often quietly. A stakeholder might say, "I talked to one customer who hated this feature. We need to rethink the whole thing." That single experience proves the problem exists for somebody, but it doesn't tell us how widespread the issue is. And without looking at broader research, the team may pivot based on that one data point. That single voice, especially if it's passionate or high profile, can overshadow dozens of usability sessions that showed neutral or positive reactions. Design critiques can follow the same pattern. Someone might say, "We tried this pattern before and it failed." That experience might be valid, but it's also contextual. Different users, different constraints, different timing, different product, yet the anecdote carries weight because it's concrete and it's personal. Engineers may reference past outages to argue against adopting a new architecture, even if the broader evidence suggests that it might be more stable. Product managers may point to one enthusiastic or passionate customer review as validation of strategy, while churn or engagement data tells a more complicated story. And even team perception can be shaped this way. One highly visible mistake can define somebody's entire reputation. A single heroic save can inflate perceived competence beyond the overall pattern, because the mind prefers stable narratives over fluctuating distributions. When teams lean too heavily on anecdotes, discussions shift from what does the data show to whose story feels more compelling. The loudest or most emotionally compelling story can outweigh systematic evidence, and over time, this erodes trust in research and analytics, especially for UX teams trying to advocate for systemic insights. So here are a few key takeaways that you can try to keep from falling from the anecdotal fallacy. First, treat stories as hypothesis, not necessarily proof. When someone shares a powerful personal experience or a vivid customer anecdote, resist the urge to act on it immediately. Instead, treat it like a hypothesis worth investigating. Ask, is this a pattern or an outlier? The story might be pointing to something real, but you won't know until you check it out. Building this habit, story first, then data, it helps your team stay grounded without dismissing the value of qualitative feedback. Next, always ask for the denominator. One of the simplest ways to combat the anecdotal fallacy is to ask, out of how many? If one user had a terrible experience, that matters, but it matters differently if it's 1 out of 10 versus 1 out of 100,000. Training your team and yourself to think in terms of base rates rather than individual cases can dramatically improve the quality of your decisions. Don't think of it as being cold or dismissing someone's experience. Think of it as putting it into the proper context. Next, be especially skeptical when emotions run high. Research shows that we're most susceptible to the anecdotal fallacy when the stakes feel personal or the topic is emotionally charged. If a story makes you feel angry or scared or excited, that's exactly when you need to slow down and look at the data. Emotional reactions are important signals, but they make terrible decision-making frameworks. Use the emotion to motivate your investigation, not to shortcut it. Next, try to create team rituals that pair stories and data. Build practices into your team's workflow that require both qualitative and quantitative evidence before major decisions. In design critiques, ask for user data alongside user quotes. In sprint planning, pair stakeholder requests with analytics. In retros, match anecdotal observations with actual metrics. And when both types of evidence sit side by side, it becomes much harder for a single story to hijack the conversation. And then lastly, watch out for the hippo's anecdote, the highest paid person's opinion. It's one of the most powerful amplifiers of the anecdotal fallacy. When a senior leader shares a personal story about their experience with the product or a conversation that they had with a customer, it carries disproportionate weight, not because it's more representative, but because of who's telling it. Teams naturally defer to authority, and a vivid story from the VP of product can quietly override weeks of research. So build a culture where anybody can respectfully say, "That's a great observation, but what does the broader data show?" regardless of the storyteller's title. Remember, the goal here is not to eliminate anecdotes. They can most definitely surface edge cases, they can highlight blind spots, they can humanize insights, and they can even help to influence the team. But at the end of the day, anecdotes should be valuable to generate hypotheses, not to settle conclusions. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for the Cognition Catalog for today. I hope we helped to shed a little bit of light on what the anecdotal fallacy is and how we can avoid some of those pitfalls at work. But I'm curious, have you run into any issues related to the anecdotal bias before? How'd you get through it? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. To learn more about the anecdotal fallacy, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com. Sign up for the newsletter to get a new bias in your inbox every week or so. And make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never have to worry about falling for any of these biases again. And if you think you're getting something out of the show, I would love it if you left a 5-star review. That would help me out so much more than you know. And if you want to pick up some big, beautiful art prints and some select biases, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/shop. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the promo code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. And if you have a favorite bias that you want to see in print, let me know. I'd be happy to take requests. Stop second-guessing your case studies and presentations. Case Owl uses AI to score your clarity, narrative strength, and alignment with best practices. And then it gives you specific fixes, not vague advice. Try it for free at caseowl.com or use my code BeyondUX for 50% off. That's caseowl with 2 O's.com. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, Zoe, and many others, and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.